Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher who advocated nonviolence and encouraged African Americans to fight for equality through peaceful protest. He helped to end legal segregation in the United States and was the key driving force behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Despite many hardships and struggles, his life was one of hope and building solidarity. The bonds that he built and the strides that he helped to make changed America and sent shock waves around the world. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January the 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. He entered Morehouse College in 1944 at the age of 15, from which he graduated at age 19 with a BA degree in sociology. In 1951, he graduated with an A average from Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, with a Bachelor of Divinity degree. By 1955, he had completed his dissertation and earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Systematic Theology from Boston University. On June the 18th, 1953, he married Coretta Scott, who was a civil rights activist and a singer. She was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. They had 4 children. Dr. King was his father's assistant pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1954, he became the full-time pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King's rise to national prominence began in December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man because she said she was tired from working all day. And for this, she was put in jail. Word of her arrest traveled all over Montgomery, and in 5 days, the Montgomery Improvement Association was organized with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president. Dr. King advised the people to not ride the Montgomery buses, and he advised them to bring about a change in a long-standing practice of segregated buses. A boycott was organized, and for over a year, 381 days, blacks picketed the white businesses and refused to use public transportation. Dr. King and his followers suffered undue hardships, and he was arrested for staging an illegal boycott. However, the cohesiveness, the togetherness of the blacks during this crisis resulted in the 1956 U.S. Supreme Court decision declaring that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. When the boycott ended, Dr. King was among the first to board the newly desegregated buses. This victory established him as a prominent civil rights leader and spokesman for the masses of black people. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine for his role in the boycott. Shortly thereafter, Dr. King organized the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 to further advance black equality. Although Dr. King walked in a godly way and preached love for his fellow man, the blood of black and white Americans once again soaked the flag of democracy. Civil rights leaders were assassinated systematically. College students were murdered and secretly buried. Little children were victims of bombings in southern black churches. Peaceful demonstrators were harassed by the police with fire hoses. German Shepherd dogs, trained to kill, were unleashed on peaceful marchers. Dr. King was brutalized and arrested more than 30 times. His home was bombed. His life and the life of his family was threatened. On one occasion, Dr. King was sent to a Georgia state prison, which caused a national outcry from the American people. Dr. King never lost sight of his dream, however, nor his commitment to nonviolence. Let no man drag you so low as to hate, he said. He pleaded that blacks should not seek to satisfy their thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. In 1963, Dr. King and other black leaders organized one of the greatest demonstrations in the history of the United States, the March on Washington. He spoke to a crowd of over 250,000 people, dramatizing the shameful plight of black Americans over the 100 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King gave his most eloquent speech, "I Have a Dream," which touched the soul of every American. On September the 15th, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama was bombed, and 4 little girls were killed. One of those little girls was my niece, Denise McNair. The church was bombed by the KKK because Dr. King and other civil rights leaders and activists often held their meetings at the church. My mother and I and other family members attended Denise's funeral, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the eulogy. Afterwards, my brother, Chris McNair, Denise's father, introduced us to Dr. King, and he shook our hands. That is an honor that I will never forget. In 1964, Dr. King watched as President Lyndon Johnson signed the Comprehensive Civil Rights Bill into law. On April the 3rd, 1968, while he was in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of the sanitation workers' strike, he spoke at Mason Temple, the headquarters of the International Churches of God in Christ, where he delivered his famous speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." The next day, on April the 4th, 1968, he was assassinated as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. For his outstanding contributions, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. received over 300 honors and awards. One of the most prestigious was the Nobel Peace Prize, which he received in 1964 at the age of 35, and he was the youngest person to receive that award at that time. There are over 900 streets in the United States named for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In its January 1964 issue, Time magazine named Dr. King Man of the Year for 1963, making him the first African American to receive this honor. The NAACP awarded him the Spingarn Medal. At least 23 countries have issued stamps in his honor. The United States has issued nearly 200 million commemorative stamps in his honor. In 1977, 9 years after his death, the United States honored him with the nation's highest civilian award, the Medal of Freedom. He was the author of 5 books. January 1986 marked the beginning of the official national observance of Dr. King's birthday, to be observed on the 3rd Monday of January each year. We thank God for the life and the great legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for the love that he exemplified for all people, and the nonviolent fight that he led and advocated for equality for all of God's children.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. And so we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In the sense we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. And we refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation until the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there's an invigorating freedom of equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hoped the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundation of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on a high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. This marvelous new militancy, which has engulfed the Negro community, must not lead us to distrust all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up in our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge to always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom has left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the victims of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Louisiana, go back to Georgia, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that this situation somehow can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of oppression, sweltering with the heat of injustice, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will join hands with little white girls and little white boys as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places shall be made plain, and the crooked places shall be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day when all of God's children will sing with the new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to become a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands in singing the words of that old Negro spiritual. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last.